The wind carried the first hint of winter, a sharp, biting promise that cut through Thomas's worn wool coat. He shivered, pulling the collar tighter around his neck as he stared at the small, empty clearing. It was all they had to show for a month of backbreaking labor, a patch of sky where a dense canopy of oak and hickory had once stood. Beside him, Silas, a man who seemed as old and weathered as the mountains themselves, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the frozen ground. "Winter's coming on fast," Silas grunted, his voice a low rumble like stones grinding together. "That wind ain't just whistlin', Dixie. It's singing a funeral dirge for any fool caught without a roof over his head." Thomas looked at the meager collection of tools laid out on a piece of oilcloth. A felling axe, a broadaxe, a single auger, and a froe. They had lost the rest of their supplies when their canoe capsized in the rapids of the Ohio River a month prior. They had escaped with their lives, their rifles, and this handful of essential tools. Everything else, the saws, the nails, the hammers, the food, was now at the bottom of the river. "We have an axe," Thomas said, his voice thin against the wind. "We can build a cabin." Silas let out a short, humorless laugh. "An axe is a fine thing, boy, the queen of all tools in this here wilderness. But a cabin ain't built with just an axe. A proper cabin needs nails, it needs saws, it needs time. We're short on all three." My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. In the modern world, we are surrounded by an abundance of tools and materials. A trip to the hardware store can provide everything we need to build a house, from pre-cut lumber to buckets of nails. But what if you had none of that? What if you were dropped in the middle of a vast, untamed wilderness with nothing but a handful of tools and the knowledge in your head? This was the reality for the American frontiersmen. They were masters of improvisation, of making something from nothing. They didn't just build cabins, they built a world using the raw materials of the forest and a level of ingenuity that is almost impossible to comprehend today. This is the story of how they did it. It's a story of how a few simple tools in the hands of a skilled craftsman could transform the wilderness into a home. It's a story of how they built everything with almost nothing. Thomas felt a familiar knot of despair tighten in his stomach. Since the accident, he had been living on the edge of panic, a constant fear that they would not survive the coming winter. He was a carpenter by trade, a man who knew his way around a workshop filled with tools. But out here, in this vast green world, his knowledge seemed useless. He knew how to build with sawn lumber and iron nails, not with raw logs and the sinew of a deer. "So what do we do?" Thomas asked, his voice betraying his fear. "We can't just give up." Silas turned and looked at him, his pale blue eyes seeming to pierce right through to the boy's soul. "Give up? Boy, give up ain't in a frontiersman's vocabulary. We don't give up. We adapt. We make do. We build." He picked up the felling axe, its worn hickory handle smooth and dark from years of use. "You see an axe. I see a sawmill. You see a tree. I see a cabin, a table, a chair, a spoon. You see a forest. I see a home. You just need to learn how to look." And so, under the old man's gruff instruction, Thomas's real education began. He learned that the axe was not just a tool for felling trees, but a precision instrument for shaping wood. He learned to hew a log, to shave off the rounded sides with the broadaxe until it was a flat, square timber. He learned to notch the logs, to cut the interlocking corners that would hold the cabin together without a single nail. Silas showed him the different types of notches, each with its own purpose. The simple saddle notch, a shallow curve cut into the top of each log, was quick and easy, but it left gaps that had to be chinked with mud and moss. The V-notch was more difficult, but it created a tighter, more weatherproof seal. And then there was the dovetail notch, the king of all notches, a complex angled joint that locked the logs together so tightly that they seemed to grow into one another. It was a masterpiece of woodworking, a joint that required a level of skill and precision that Thomas had never imagined possible with just an axe. "But what about the roof, Silas?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat by the fire, the half-finished walls of the cabin rising behind them like the skeleton of some great beast. "And the floor? We have no saws to cut boards." Silas smiled, a rare and fleeting thing that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You're still thinking like a town carpenter, boy. You're thinking about what you ain't got instead of what you do. We don't need a saw, we have a wedge, and we have the forest." The next day, Silas showed him how to split a log into rough planks. It was a simple yet ingenious technique. They felled a straight-grained oak, and using the axe and a series of wooden wedges that they carved themselves, they carefully split the log in half, then in quarters, then in eighths. The work was maddening. The wedges would slip, the splits would run crooked, and more than once a promising log was reduced to a pile of useless firewood. One afternoon, after a particularly stubborn piece of oak refused to yield, Thomas threw his mallet to the ground in a fit of rage. His hands were blistered, his back was a knot of pain, and his spirit was frayed to the breaking point. "I can't do this," he yelled, his voice raw with frustration. He kicked at the defiant log. "This is impossible. It's not carpentry, it's butchery. I'm a carpenter, Silas, not a savage hacking at trees with a rock." He slumped to the ground, burying his face in his hands. The despair he had been holding at bay washed over him, a cold and suffocating tide. He was going to fail. They were going to die out here, and it would be his fault, his inadequacy. Silas watched him, his expression unreadable. He didn't offer words of comfort or encouragement. He simply picked up the mallet, walked over to the log, and with a few expertly placed taps of the wedges, split the wood cleanly in two. He then looked at Thomas, a glint in his eye. "The wood knows," he said quietly. "It knows when you're fighting it. It knows when you're scared. You ain't just splitting a log, boy. You're splitting the fear in your own heart. Now get up. The wood's waiting." Slowly, Thomas rose. He looked at the perfectly split plank, then at the old man. He picked up his mallet, his anger replaced by a grudging respect and a flicker of renewed determination. He had a long way to go, but he was beginning to understand. This was a different kind of work, a different kind of world, and he had to become a different kind of man to survive in it. By the end of the day, they had a stack of rough-hewn boards. "They're not pretty," Thomas said, his voice subdued. "They're not meant to be pretty," Silas retorted. "They're meant to be strong. They're meant to keep the snow off your head and the dirt from between your toes. This ain't a king's palace, boy. This is a home." He then introduced Thomas to the froe, a tool that looked like a crude L-shaped blade. With a heavy wooden mallet, Silas drove the froe into the end of a short log, splitting off thin, uniform shingles for the roof. It was a rhythmic, satisfying process, a testament to the simple elegance of a well-designed tool. But the real revelation for Thomas came when they began to build the furniture. With no nails, he had assumed they would have to make do with rough log benches and a simple plank table. But Silas had other ideas. He showed Thomas how to use the auger to create mortise and tenon joints, a form of wooden joinery that was as old as the hills, a way of fitting two pieces of wood together with a precisely cut hole and a corresponding peg. They built a table with legs that were pegged into the top, a set of stools that were as sturdy as if they had been forged from iron, and a bed frame that was lashed together with cordage that Silas had made from the inner bark of a cedar tree. He had soaked the bark in the river for a week, then pounded it with a rock until it was soft and pliable. He then twisted the long fibers together, creating a rope that was as strong as any that Thomas had ever seen in a store. "Everything you need is right here," Silas said, gesturing to the forest around them. "The trees give you wood for your home, your fire, your tools. The animals give you meat for your belly, hides for your clothes, and sinew for your bowstring. The river gives you water to drink and a path to travel. You just need to know how to ask for it." As the cabin took shape, Thomas began to see the forest not as an enemy, but as a partner. He learned to read the subtle language of the trees, to know which wood was best for building, which for burning, and which for carving. The final piece of the puzzle was the fireplace. It was the heart of the cabin, the source of warmth and light, the place where they would cook their food and gather on long winter nights. But building a fireplace without bricks or mortar was a challenge that seemed insurmountable to Thomas. "We have stone," Silas said simply, "and we have clay." They spent the next week gathering stones from the riverbed, carefully selecting flat, stable rocks that would fit together like the pieces of a puzzle. They then dug clay from the riverbank, mixing it with dried grass to give it strength and cohesion. It was a messy, laborious process, but as the fireplace began to rise, stone by stone, Thomas felt a sense of awe. They were building a fireplace from the very earth itself, a structure that was as ancient and as enduring as the mountains. They chinked the gaps between the logs with the same clay and grass mixture, creating a tight seal against the wind and the cold. For the windows, they had no glass. But Silas showed Thomas how to make a translucent window covering from a deer hide. They scraped the hide clean, stretched it thin on a wooden frame, and then rubbed it with animal fat until it was waterproof and let in a soft, diffused light. On the day they finished the cabin, a light snow was falling, dusting the world in a blanket of white. They stood in the doorway, looking out at the transformed clearing. The rough, hand-hewn cabin, with its stone fireplace and its hide windows, seemed to have grown from the earth itself. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth and the winter wind howled outside, Thomas felt a sense of peace that he had not known since they had first set out on their journey. He was warm, he was safe, and he was home. He looked at Silas, who was sitting by the fire, carving a spoon from a piece of scrap wood. The old man's face was illuminated by the firelight, his eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "Why did you stay, Silas?" Thomas asked quietly, the question that had been burning in his mind for weeks. "After the canoe capsized, you could have gone on your own. You would have moved faster. Why stay with me?" Silas didn't look up from his carving. For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft scrape of his knife against the wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and heavy with memory. "I had a son once," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "about your age, full of fire and vinegar, just like you. Thought he knew everything. We were trapping up in the high country, the year of the deep snow. I told him to respect the mountains, to watch the signs. But he was young and full of pride. Went out on his own to check his line. An avalanche. It took him." Silas paused, his knife still. He stared into the fire, his eyes seeing a different time, a different place. "I found him buried in the snow. Just a boy. My boy. I buried him on that mountain. And a part of me was buried there with him. For years I just wandered. A ghost in the woods. Didn't care if I lived or died. Then I found you, half drowned, and full of that same damn fire. And I saw him. I saw my boy." He finally looked at Thomas, his eyes glistening in the firelight. "I couldn't save my own son from his pride. Maybe I can save you from yours. Maybe I can teach you what I should have taught him. That the wilderness don't care how strong you are. It only cares how smart you are, how humble you are, how much you're willing to learn. Thomas was speechless. He saw not just a grizzled old mountain man, but a grieving father, a man haunted by a past he could never escape. He understood now. This wasn't just about survival. It was about redemption. It was about a father's love, reaching across the years, trying to save a son he had already lost. The cabin was a fortress against the winter, but a fortress is only as good as the supplies within it. One evening, watching Thomas struggle to scoop stew with a flat piece of bark, Silas shook his head. "A man ain't a savage, boy. We got the means. We just need the will." The next morning, Silas led Thomas to a large, gnarled burl he had spotted on the side of a massive maple tree. "There's your bowls, your cups, your spoons." Back at the cabin, he showed Thomas how to use the adze, a curved blade designed for hollowing out wood. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to hollow out the burl. Days later, they had a collection of beautiful, durable wooden bowls and cups, each one unique, each one a small miracle of frontier ingenuity. They needed containers for storage. Silas showed Thomas how to carefully peel birch bark in large sheets. They folded the bark into box-like shapes, stitching the seams with cordage made from spruce roots. The seams were then sealed with pine pitch, a sticky, waterproof resin. The result was a set of lightweight, waterproof containers perfect for storing their food. But their greatest challenge came when the handle of their only auger broke. It was a disaster. The auger was essential for drilling the holes for the mortise and tenon joints, the very foundation of their nailless construction. Thomas was devastated. "It's over," he said, his voice hollow. "We can't fix it. We don't have the tools to fix a tool." Silas picked up the broken pieces, his brow furrowed in thought. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "We don't need to fix it. We need to make a new one, and the forest will provide." He led Thomas to a fallen ironwood tree, a species known for its incredible density and strength. They spent the next 2 days carving a new handle for the auger, using only their axes and knives. It was a slow, arduous process, a battle of wills between the men and the wood. But finally they had a new handle, one that was stronger and more durable than the original. They fitted the metal auger, bit into the new handle, securing it with a rawhide wrapping that tightened as it dried. Thomas held the repaired auger in his hands, a sense of wonder washing over him. They had faced a problem that seemed insurmountable, and they had overcome it with nothing but their own 2 hands and the resources of the forest. Winter settled in, a long, hard season of deep snow and bitter cold, but inside they were warm and secure. Life settled into a new rhythm. Thomas learned to live by the rhythms of the wild, to read the signs of the weather in the sky, to track the movements of the animals in the snow. He spent hours with Silas, learning the deeper secrets of the forest. He learned which plants could be used for medicine, which for food. He learned to make snares from sinew and triggers from bent saplings, to catch rabbits and squirrels. He learned to tan the hides, to scrape them clean and smoke them over a slow fire until they were soft and pliable. It was a hard life, a life stripped down to its bare essentials, but there was a purity to it, a sense of purpose that Thomas had never known before. Every task, no matter how small, was essential. Every day was a victory. One day, as the first signs of spring began to appear, Silas fell ill. It was a fever, a deep consuming fire that left him weak and delirious. Thomas did everything he could. He brewed teas from the medicinal plants Silas had shown him. He kept the fire going. He bathed the old man's brow with cool water from the river, but the fever would not break. For days, Thomas sat by Silas's side, a silent, helpless vigil. The fear, the old, familiar fear, returned. But this time, it was different. This time, he did not panic. He looked around the cabin, at the solid, hand-hewn walls, at the sturdy, pegged furniture, at the warm, glowing fireplace. He looked at his own hands, calloused and strong, the hands of a builder. He had built this world with his own 2 hands. He had faced the wilderness, and he had not been broken. He had learned to survive. He went to the fireplace and stirred the embers. He went to the well and drew fresh water. He went to the forest and checked his snares, returning with a fat rabbit for their supper. He did what needed to be done. He did what Silas had taught him to do. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Silas awoke, weak but lucid. He looked at Thomas, a long, searching look, and then he smiled. "You did good, boy," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "You did good." Thomas felt a wave of relief so profound that it almost brought him to his knees. He had done it. He had faced the ultimate test, and he had not failed. As spring finally arrived, melting the snow and bringing the forest back to life, they were no longer alone. A new family of settlers, the Millers, arrived in the valley, their wagon broken and their spirits even more so. They were a stark reflection of what Thomas and Silas had been months ago. Unprepared, overwhelmed, and terrified, they stared at the cabin with wide, disbelieving eyes. Mr. Miller, a man with soft hands and a haunted look, ran a hand over the dovetail notches. "My God," he whispered, "we were told this was an empty valley. We didn't expect this. How did you build this? We have a wagon full of tools, and we can't even fix a broken axle." Thomas, seeing their desperation, felt a surge of confidence he hadn't known he possessed. He was no longer the frightened boy who had despaired at the sight of a broken tool. He was a builder. He was a survivor. "You're looking at it the wrong way," Thomas heard himself say, the words echoing Silas's own from what seemed like a lifetime ago. "You're thinking about what you ain't got. The forest will provide." He spent the next few days helping the Millers. He showed Mr. Miller how to select a strong piece of hickory and carve a new axle for the wagon, using only an axe and a knife. He showed Mrs. Miller how to make a poultice from yarrow for her child's fever, a remedy he had learned from Silas. He helped them build a temporary shelter, a simple lean-to, but one that was sturdy and weatherproof. They watched him with a mixture of awe and gratitude. He was no longer just a boy. He was a figure of authority, a man who knew the ways of the wilderness. He moved with a quiet confidence, his hands sure and steady, his eyes seeing not just the problems, but the solutions that lay hidden in the world around them. One evening, as they shared a meal of roasted rabbit around the Miller's small fire, Mr. Miller shook his head in amazement. "You're a natural at this," he said. "It's like you were born out here." Thomas looked over at Silas, who was watching him with a proud smile. "I wasn't," Thomas said, "but I had a good teacher." In that moment, Thomas understood the final lesson. The skills he had learned were not just for his own survival. They were for the survival of the community. They were a part of a larger story, a story of people helping people, of knowledge being passed from one generation to the next. It was the story of how a nation was built, not by grand armies or powerful kings, but by ordinary people, in small, forgotten corners of the wilderness, who learned to rely on each other and on the land itself. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a part of something bigger. He was a frontiersman. Years later, long after Silas had passed on and the clearing had grown into a small, thriving settlement, Thomas would often walk to the edge of the forest and look back at the original cabin. It was a relic of a bygone era, a testament to a time when survival was a daily struggle, a time when a man's worth was measured not by the coins in his pocket, but by the skill in his hands and the knowledge in his head. New settlers would arrive, with their wagons full of tools and supplies, and they would marvel at the old cabin. They would run their hands over the hand-hewn logs, the pegged furniture, the stone, fireplace. They would ask him how he had built it, how he had managed to create such a solid, enduring structure with so little. And Thomas would smile, a slow, knowing smile that was so much like the one Silas used to wear. He would pick up an axe, its handle worn smooth from years of use, and he would say, "You don't need much, you just need to know how to look. You see an axe, I see a sawmill. You see a tree, I see a home." He would show them how to read the grain of the wood, how to split a log with a wedge, how to carve a dovetail notch that would lock the logs together for 100 years. He would pass on the knowledge that Silas had given him, the knowledge of the forest, the knowledge of survival, the knowledge of how to build everything with almost nothing. And in doing so, he was not just teaching them how to build a cabin. He was teaching them how to build a life. He was passing on the spirit of the American frontier, a spirit of ingenuity, of resilience, of unyielding determination, a spirit that was as strong and as enduring as the ancient trees of the forest, a spirit that had built a nation. This was the true legacy of the frontiersmen, not the cabins they built or the land they cleared, but the knowledge they carried, the skills they perfected, the spirit they embodied. It was a legacy of self-reliance, of making do, of seeing not just what was, but what could be. It was a legacy that was as raw and as beautiful as the wilderness itself, a legacy that was carved into the very heart of America.